First question comes from Lorem Ipsum, and it's about this man called Oleksiy Arestovych. Arestovych is a political strategist and an advisor of Zelensky. And in 2003, when he's about 5 years older than me, so he is 27 then, he begins to talk about a Russian war with Ukraine. In around 2008, he makes a prediction about the annexation of Crimea, and in 2019 he gives this, you're going to see it in a second, relatively accurate description of the Russian war with Ukraine in 2022.
Если Украина получает ПДЧ в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно брали.
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно, Нет, не НАТО. Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирайте Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весах, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
Что такое может быть крупная война с Россией?
Это воздушная операция наступательная, вторжение российских армий, 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в АТО находятся, ВОЗ, операция Объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Каховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать. Наступление с территории Беларуси, там, создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее. Воздушно-десантный. Вот что такое полноценная война. И вероятность ее 99%.
Когда?
После 21-22 самый критический, 20-22 самый критический.
Impressive, right? He deserves the credit for this prediction. There is no doubt about that. I think that the NATO bit is obviously questionable, and Arestovych now doesn't believe in it anymore. So the idea was that if Russia loses the war with Ukraine, that he thought was inevitable, then NATO would be an option for Ukraine as long as it beats Russia in the war. No. Ukraine doesn't get to join NATO as long as Russia is a semi-functional state. There's just no way that the kind of regime that's there in Moscow would allow Ukraine to join NATO, even if it lost the war 3 times over. Putin would rather tactically nuke Ukraine than let it join NATO. And now it's off the table. When Ukraine wants to join NATO, NATO doesn't want Ukraine, and so Ukraine are now arriving at a position where they say, we're happy to take NATO off the table because it's just unrealistic, and that's part of the negotiations that are going on now. The other thing that's interesting is this war inevitable in terms of a logic that's quite independent of Putin? I do think there is something to that. I'm not going to throw that off the table. But I think it's mostly not true. In other words, take away Putin and put in his place nearly anyone around him. I don't think this war happens. I mean, I doubt that Shoigu does this war. I don't think Gerasimov, the head of the army, does this war. I mean, I don't think Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, does this war. You saw how shivery, if you watched my previous videos, the head of the SVR, Narishkin, was about the prospect of the war when he discovered virtually live on TV, not quite live, virtually live on TV that the war was happening. I mean, who else? The hawkish Patrushev? No. I mean, he wouldn't do the war. Who else? So this is a problem. In other words, if Putin drowns in a lake tomorrow, that's his project gone. But Arestovych is very, very sharp, very, very bright. He can slide over into having views about questions that are a bit beyond his expertise. but he's a very sharp boy. He's in his lovely, charismatic, good-looking boy in his mid-40s. So he can make more accurate predictions, and he is regularly dropping commentaries on the war in Ukrainian and in Russian every day. But what I'd warn you about is that he is officially more or less speaking for the Ukrainian government at the moment. Doesn't mean he's wrong, but keep that as a label. But we've got a second question here, also from Lorem Ipsum, and so we're gonna read that too, and that's about this video that a prepper channel showed, a video from the Russian main propaganda channel. So let's watch that and comment on it.
First off, Vladimir Solovyev is a, best way to put him would be like a Joe Rogan or Alex Jones. That was who I was thinking of there when my mind went blank. He's that type of personality, a conspiracy type theorist who has a tendency to be proven right. Putin loves this guy to the tune of Solovyev, get this, makes $1 million a month.
Получите ядерный удар по территории Европы в случае, если вы соберетесь там с какой-нибудь миротворческий контингент НАТО создать, в случае, если вы соберетесь его куда-то там вводить и прочее, прочее. Да, это будет ядерная война. А это было и сказано. Это будет ядерная война. Вы должны это понимать. Значит, храбрые поляки, от вашей Варшавы не останется за полсекунды ничего. Храбрые немцы, так сказать, да. Храбрые эстонцы, храбрые прибалты. Кстати, по поводу храбрых прибалтов. Вот в Калининграде, я знаю, сейчас большие проблемы на границе. Может быть, актуальным становится вопрос коридора до Калининграда. Коридора, сухопутного коридора до Калининграда. А почему нет? Ну, если уж до Приднестровья мне кажется, что государства под названием Литва и государства под названием Польша ведут себя слишком нагло. Слишком нагло. И не понимают еще, так сказать, да, что вот на самом деле с ними можно разобраться быстрее, чем с Украиной.
So let's be clear about what this is. Our prepper friend actually made a good video. No problems there, but there's a small correction to be made. This guy is not what this prepper man said he was, which is the Russian Joe Rogan. This guy is a professional liar and professional actor, and he is employed by the Russian government. And every single person on that show is effectively employed in the role of an actor by the Russian government. This is not a discussion program with Russian analysts speaking. This is a show contrived for the consumption, for consumption by the Russian population. That's what you have to understand is happening. Now, a key function of these shows is that they have to run ahead of the steam train, as it were. So if Putin wants to escalate the situation to 4, he's always going to have people verbally escalating it to 7 so that he looks a bit more moderate. This has been a constant trick. The best performer of this kind has been the ultra-nationalist and also really actor Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who's now at death's door with COVID, even though he's got something like 8 Russian vaccinations. Some of them are good vaccinations, actually. Some of them are bad vaccinations, because Russia has more than one vaccine. Sputnik works. I mean, that's an amazing situation, given that he was an advocate for the damn vaccination program that's failed so badly in Russia because of a lack of public trust. So that's the show. The fact that they say shit doesn't mean that shit is real. Is that shit real? It's real in the sense that we argue on our main channel here, which is that there's a project of escalation that the Kremlin aren't even running as such, that the Kremlin is caught up in. And that escalation does go beyond Ukraine. And maybe that escalation is independent of Putin too. So there is a possibility of escalation. absolutely, to NATO countries. But I think that escalation would be just that, escalation. It would not be Russia deciding to invade another country, and a NATO country. That's not how it would work. It would be a series of escalatory steps, and then we'd end up with something worst case scenario, like a tactical nuclear strike on some kind of military installation in Poland, without any civilians being killed. But I mean, that's not the same as what these guys are saying, that we need to go further beyond Ukraine. Putin does not have clear territorial plans beyond Ukraine. He's going to be realistic and opportunistic as much as that's possible within his now phantasmagoric civilizational way of thinking about the world. So that's what I'd say about that. Don't take these shows to be actual discussions of anything. They're there very often to give a more radical view of the situation than what the Kremlin actually gives, so as to make the Kremlin look more moderate. So that's the answer. No one you know asks, is this true? What's the background and the real deal about this neo-Nazi Azov Battalion story that everybody's talking about? It's a thing, it's an issue, but there's a subset of the commentariat which is going on about it all the time, and if somebody's going on about it all the time, they're not seriously engaging with reality, because Ukraine's at war with a regime that has many fascist elements, Russia. Ukraine does not have a single fascist in government, and Ukraine probably doesn't have a single fascist in parliament. It would have a tiny number of ultra-nationalists. That's about it. So you're going to find more fascists in major European parliaments. You're going to find more Nazi sympathizers in the German Bundestag than in Ukrainian Rada. They've got a Jewish president. So that's the bottom line. The Azov Battalion story is basically it's 2014. Russia is invading in a kind of hybrid way. Ukraine essentially doesn't have a functional army. So lots of battalions form, and there is the National Guard. And eventually these battalions are sort of incorporated, tamed, but the Azov story is a bit different. There are a few Nazis in it, a good number of Nazis in it. And at one point it becomes a little bit of a political movement, not just a battalion. And it gets a little bit of couriering from a politician who was the interior minister of Ukraine, Arestovych, who is not a fascist. So now we're in this kind of weird situation where the Azov Battalion has tried to distance itself a little bit from the Nazi symbolism. I think they've banned some expressions of Nazi symbolism. You've got the problem now that they're a good battalion and they're needed for the war. You've got the problem that a lot of people want to join them simply because they're an effective fighting force. So what number of folks in the battalion now have Nazi sympathizers? I'm sure it's a good number. I don't know how many. How many people are in the battalion? I would say maybe 2,000, something like that. So that's it. I mean, that's not good. That's not great. But that's not a first priority concern in the middle of a war. I mean, historically, the concern with the Azov Battalion isn't that there's a small number of Nazi sympathizers around. It's been that the battalion can attract people from different countries who can come and gather, and therefore it plays a role in some kind of, international Nazi sympathizing momentum. So that's the worry about it. It's not in the top 20 issues that really matter when we look at this war, and there are people in the West making a living out of writing about it more than it needs to be done, really. So it's really a matter of saying, yes, it's an issue, but let's keep the proportion. Does that answer your question? I hope it does a little bit. Next question comes from Máté, who asks, what about Stepan Bandera, this Ukrainian Nazi ultranationalist independence fighter who was killed in the 1950s? Is he not like a rag in front of a bull as far as Putin is concerned? And Putin is Putin getting overexcited about the fact that Bandera is celebrated still in Ukraine? And isn't that bad too? Because isn't that like erecting statues to Goebbels? No, it's not like erecting statues quite to Goebbels, but we have got a man here who is directly responsible for the deaths of thousands and indirectly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands. So let's be absolutely clear about that. And the guy's a Nazi. A Nazi collaborator, and collaborate is too weak a word. Now, there's a complex history why some people feel that he is a freedom fighter. But basically, you should find Bandera offensive. And if I were Ukrainian, I would not want shit to be called after him. I would not want to be walking down a Bandera street. Having said that, I mean, look at Russia. I mean, Russia is full of mass murderers. Many of them have been taken down. But Lenin is still all over Russia, even though so many Lenins got taken down. But the damn thing is still lying around in the center of Moscow, in that mausoleum where I was forced to go as a child by my school. And I queued up to see this yellow thing. I queued up for like 2 hours to see this yellow thing lying there. He was, Lenin, by the way, I can give you my professional opinion. He is a very good political theorist. Very good political theorist. Mass murderer, though. Mass murderer with serious mental health issues. So no, that's not good. Is Putin overexcited about Bandera? A bit, actually, yes. He also can't pronounce Bandera's name right. He says Bandera. He always says, эти бендеровцы, эти бендеровцы. So, yes, Putin is overexcited. Is this something that's a huge, undiscovered secret factor here that gives us an explanation of the war? No, it isn't. But yeah, Putin often refers to followers of Bandera as though they were ubiquitous in Ukraine and as though it was a sort of relevant political factor more than it really is. I think what often happens in Ukraine is that because up until this war, this is all now changed, but up until this war, sense of what Ukraine was civically was always so fragile. I mean, Ukraine has always been brilliant at quarreling with itself. I think that a lot of people who do think that Bandera is, use Putin's pronunciation, is a murderer, they just said, well, we've got bigger fish to fry than people who are inappropriately sympathetic to some person who died 70 years ago. So often it kind of is put under the carpet, and you don't have Ukrainians who feel this guy is a murderer confronting Ukrainians who treat him as a freedom fighter. What the latest state of public opinion on Bandera would be in Ukraine, I don't know. I think it'd be quite divided, probably not very enthusiastic in any direction, but it'd be quite divided, I think, with maybe a few more people thinking him odious than the number of people who like him, and then lots of people in the I don't really know category. That would be my sense. Next question comes from Hilltown Graymers, and I'm going to put this up because it's actually very nicely put, but basically it's a very typical story. I've got this friend is anti-imperialist, this friend hates all the bad things that the United States does, but suddenly my friend is sympathetic to Putin and actually sympathetic to this invasion, even though you would think as an anti-imperialist I mean, you should really be against this invasion. What does one make of that? And how does one explain this sort of cult of Putin on the left? I think this is such a good question that it actually requires an episode on it, because I think you know a lot of people, if you just are aware of what's going on, if not in your social circle, then online. You just know a lot of people who are in that bubble if you're watching this video. We all do. Look, the trick I use with these people in real life is very, very simple. Okay, so you're expressing sympathy to Putin's moves. What do you know about the Putin regime? Like, what's the regime like? How does it work? Who's in it? What do they want? What's the Russian state like? What's it like to be in Russia? What's it like to be somebody like you in Russia? What would happen to you if you were in Russia? Could you speak freely? Could you get into politics? Could you protest? And immediately you discover these people know absolutely sweet FA about Russia, and so their view is completely irrelevant because they have at best a cartoonish understanding of the actions of the country they're excusing. You can actually see this phenomena on a question, I think Michelle's question, which I answered about John Mearsheimer. And that video, given that we're only about 800 people on this second channel, this video got a lot of views for this channel. The Mearsheimer fanboys, mostly boys, came over. And so the majority of the comments are from Mearsheimer fanboys. And none of these intellectual infantiles have any understanding of Russia. So they are defending the actions of a country they're not even remotely entitled to assess properly because they know jack shit about it. They've just followed the logic, and all the comments are, yeah, you listen to the lecture, man, you gotta listen to the lecture, man. Which I didn't do. I read the Foreign Affairs article, which I think is the same thing. But I also listened to Mearsheimer's recent lecture. Mearsheimer is a very solid and highly, highly professionally competent academic and international relations historian, theorist, and so on. But he is, in a more sophisticated form, making the same mistake. He is talking about Russia without talking about Russia. This is a question from actually a friend of mine, a beautiful friend called Karen. Karen, I'm going to try to answer your question. And what you are asking me is, when are we going to have a cigar together soon? No, you're not asking that. You should ask that. You're saying, oh, Vlad, it looks like you're describing a shift that's quite a big shift in Russia toward this sort of totalitarian side, that you're not just talking about the security establishment and other parts of the Russian political network, just trying to scare opponents a little bit, trying to scare members of the regime a bit. You're talking about a significant and material extension or change in the repression, oppression of the general population. Yes, I am. Is this a permanent shift? No, it's not permanent because it's permanent, but it's permanent and can only get worse until the regime goes. They don't have a reverse gear. Is this a permanent shift because of the impact of sanctions? So this then is going to make me look like I'm contradicting myself. So part of what the sanctions will do is possibly not allow Russia to have a chance of becoming a fully formed totalitarian state, even though it probably wouldn't have become that without the sanctions either. So they're not making that crucial a difference, but they're going to make it harder because there's going to be no money. Totalitarianism costs money. And the problem is that the Russian state, as we discussed in one of our previous videos, is not fully built. And what the sanctions will absolutely make sure happens is that it doesn't succeed in building itself. And it's going to be fucked because it's not built enough to be autarkic like the Soviet Union could at least have a go at being. The state can't be. It's locked into a series of global mechanisms that almost compensate for its unbuilt quality. So there is basically no infrastructure for mass repression, like truly mass repression. So that's going to be one stopping point. Another stopping point is that the regime is fundamentally not set on mobilizing the population. It's set on demobilizing the population. So it's not going to have an industry of sort of citizen participation in people's arrests and evictions and, you know, people being taken hostage and taken away. There's not going to be that kind of industry that you had in the Stalinist period, but there will be more denunciations. But well short of that, there's still room to get more repressive, and the regime will keep on doing that. There is no doubt. What's happened so far is what I already shared with Karen in a phone message, and that's that basically all of the European Russians psychologically in terms of their values, people who look to Europe politically as well and culturally, these people have been told by the regime effectively, you are now second-class citizens. And the key signal sent to them was that they shut down all the free media. And the way these people experienced that wasn't just that their sources of information were confiscated and their sources of discourse were confiscated. No. They felt that this was a signal to them saying, okay, we've kept this shit here because there's a small number of you and you sort of mill around with it and you listen to it and you engage with it. Well, we don't want you here. We don't even want you pasturing yourselves on a little reservation. We don't need you anymore. Deal with it. We're not going to get rid of you as it were biologically, but as you know, members of our society and our culture, we don't want you. So this is the first signal we're sending. We're going to send more. So freedom of speech will very, very much go. And there is going to be an extension both of the terror state in terms of how many people it picks up, but that it'll never get to mass repression, and in terms of what it picks people up for. So there really will be completely innocent, non-political people going to jail for years for some random shit they've said online. And that hasn't really been happening before, except in very unusual cases. Now it'll happen to more people. But more does not mean if you do X, you're cooked. No. It means that if you do X and 10 other people do X, well, there's 11 of you. Well, one of you is going to be in trouble. And, you know, you want to be lucky that it's not going to be you. So that's going to be how it is. And it is a change, because I think that it's right to use the word totalitarian, at least with some qualifications about this turn. And so the regime has stopped being authoritarian and it's become totalitarian, at least in some respects. And the labels I have used are sort of really weird. I've said that Russia has moved from pointillistic authoritarianism to pointillistic totalitarianism. And this will tighten, but that's prediction one. Prediction two, it will never get to a level of mass repression. I don't see the state as being capable of that. So that's not a good answer, actually, but it's a bit of a milling around of that sort of territory we're at. Thank you so much, Karen. Next question comes from AXL 100, and it's really so similar to Karen's question that I'm gonna try to answer it by saying something new, perhaps. With so many ghost towns in Siberia, what's so implausible about, you know, wide repressions being carried out by the Putin regime? Well, on top of everything I've said, I might also add that this is a regime that doesn't have an ideology, and you have got to have some kind of ideology, I think, to help you with the mass repressions, if you're going to do them. That's another thing pointing against them, as well as this sort of incomplete nature of the Russian state apparatus, the impoverishment of the Russian state, the fact that it doesn't want people to be mobilized, it needs to keep people sort of apathetic. And then the perceived legitimacy of the regime, with or without ideology, is so fragile, actually, that you don't want a situation where you politicize your citizens. That's what I would say again and repeat, basically. Because the regime knows that once Russian citizens are politicized, it's just where the wind's going to blow. They could just go and take the regime away. And don't forget, if Russians do come out, they're going to be more violent than Belarusians. The Belarusians were out in mass numbers, but they stayed extraordinarily civil. If Russians had come out in the same numbers against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus, there'd be no regime left. So what's happening now is that Russians are depoliticized. I've called Russians a population who aren't citizens in my last video. And I think that the last thing this regime wants is to mobilize people into having a certain political narrative and having a certain sense of political belonging. The regime knows that if and when it does that, it's a coin toss about whether that crowd turns on it or not. And it can't control that. And it probably will turn on it. So that's what's going to stop it. That the regime is locked into a deal with the population, which is that the population doesn't think of itself as citizenry. The population thinks that politics is something that happens over there, and the regime deals over there with all of this political business, and the citizens are sort of there in a vicarious way. There's a sort of a mannequin version of each citizen on that in that political sphere that the citizens pretend is their real self, and the regime pretends is their real self, but in fact they aren't even there. It's just some kind of a fake representation of them. They're here, and they tend to not go over the fence to this political territory. But if the government actually properly takes them to that political territory, it's going to be in real trouble. It's going to mobilize the citizenry without any capacity to control it, to control what the citizenry thinks. So that's a little bit more of the same answer, dancing in the circle.